Today's topic, we use the provocative title, Winners and Losers, intentionally, right? And so one of the things I want to discuss first out with Rob is sort of challenging conventional wisdom around the notion that there will be winners and losers, in contrast to something that's often taught in economics called the Luddite fallacy. So if you're not familiar with the Luddites were, in Britain, they were against some of the technology in the textile industry as it was disrupting their lives, and the technology was a net negative. And economists said that's a fallacy or an argument that is false, because the technology it raises the tide for everybody, and eventually it works well. And that's been true for a long time. The Luddite fallacy has been true, especially for analog transformations. So one of the concepts that creates winners and losers, and this is, I would like to get Rob's point of view on this, is the notion that when we pivot to an accelerating digital transformation, things that transfer or transform at machine speed, humans don't have the ability to adapt fast enough. Therein creating what we call today the Luddite fallacy. And that creates the notion of winners and losers. So first of all, Rob, I'd ask you, do you agree that one way to define loser is to say, I am better off than I was last year, but everyone else is much better off, therefore I lost on a relative basis. Versus, and let's use the term for tonight's discussion as losers being people who are going to be worse off than they are today. Do you agree that that's going to happen?
So I think it's important to distinguish between the notion of winning and losing as a ladder, where every rung of that ladder represents a different degree of winning or losing, and the idea is mostly that we're attempting to get up further up that ladder than anybody else or other people getting down, from another notion of winning and losing, which I think is more of, I almost think of it as a matrix, as a spreadsheet of, where every row in the spreadsheet is a person in the world, and where every column in the spreadsheet is a different facet of our life and what matters to us. And to some extent, it may be, what we do to move up or down the column relative to other people, but maybe more of it is about, if there is a sum that represents all the things that are meaningful to us as an individual, and we presume that we're distributed the progression or digression that we experience in each of those facets, winning and losing may or may not be a matter of whether we get ahead of anybody else in any one aspect of that, but whether as an aggregate we feel like we've accomplished what we're looking for, whether what we have accomplished is meaningful.
You would reject the hierarchical notion of winning and losing, and that it's a contest between each other. Is that fair?
I think that that's right, because I don't know that any of us are ever in such a narrow definition of our experience that we can only measure ourselves on that one dimension.
So let's define it in a way that says, because winning and losing is such a loaded term, is to simply say, will people today, as we look at where they sit today, in the future, be in a better position to take care of the things that are important to them, whatever that may be. We can use Maslow's hierarchy of needs or whatever it might be. But will they be in a better position in the future, or worse off, or will it be a split model where you have this notion of winners and losers?
Yeah, I don't subscribe to the idea that we will inherently be better off or worse off than anybody else, only because what may be better for one person is only that they've progressed in one area of what matters to them versus any others that may matter to somebody else. I mean, another way of thinking about this is actually in terms of not who we are and whether we individually have progressed or not, but rather what kind of impact and influence are we having as individuals on the world around us. And rather than measuring the individual in terms of their success or failure to progress or not, measure the people that matter to them, their family, their friends, their colleagues, in part because I think that a way of representing that culmination of values is how we project those sets of values on the people that we care about and how we, through that, amplify them and whether they are progressing or not in the things that they care about. So rather than getting narrowly defined on us as individually or focusing on a single individual, think about what role they have in the society that they've created and how they're using that advancement, that personal advancement, to position themselves within that society, to amplify that society, to benefit that society. Again, because I think that the effect is going to be somewhat measured on how they influence other people, but also because irrespective of the digital economy and what we do to exploit the digital economy to create that advancement, it's as equally important that we have grounding in our support network, in our support system, the people that ultimately enable us to move forward. Yep. I don't think that any of us operate so perfectly in a vacuum that we can claim that all of our advancements are due strictly to our own personal contributions. It's always going to be some sort of network effect, and whether that's family or friends or colleagues or however large you want to create that group that defines your society, it's really that together that matters.
So Bain put out a white paper, I think this past week, called Labor 2030. And we had our team read through that, and we discussed it in one of our recent podcasts. But Bain's supposition in the white paper is that somewhere between 30 and 40 million jobs over the next decade will be eliminated or impacted in a way where they'll no longer exist in their current form over the next 10 years. And they talked about the whole issue about what does that mean. And they said only about 20% of the current workforce would benefit from this transition, meaning there'd be more victims than losers. And at some level that kind of drove us to think about this notion of winners and losers. Let me just ask this question to the audience. How many people are viewed, let's look at this positively. How many people view that what's going on in the digital agenda in the broadest possible terms as a personal opportunity for them that opens up a lot more doors versus the opposite of that, which would be I'm really anxious about the future? How many people are optimistic about this? Okay, so about half the people, maybe 60%. That's a fair number, given this is a self-selecting audience to be at this. But Rob, what's your sense of, you work with IBM, with Watson, one of the premier companies on research in AI and the deployment of digital technologies. When we talk about the knowledge work being impacted by advanced, machine learning, AI, et cetera, what do you think the impact is going to be to the knowledge workers is going to displace that many people? Do you think Bain's overstating it?
Well, actually, to clarify, when you said 30, 40 million jobs, I think what you meant was 30, 40 million roles, not individuals, correct?
Roles, right.
Yeah. So, look, let me speak out of both sides of my mouth here, because I think that there's two perspectives that are important to understand. First of all, yes, I do think that people are going to be impacted by AI. I think there are some jobs that may be eliminated entirely, or certainly will be transformed to the point where we don't quite identify them the same way that we do today. That said, and I feel this is probably true of most technologies anyway, but it's especially germane to AI because of its close approximation to what we considered most uniquely human about us, which is our intelligence. It has less to do, the people that will benefit from AI and the way that people will benefit from AI has less to do with their job being eliminated or preserved, and has more to do with how their job gets transformed and how they leverage AI to amplify themselves. And by that, I also mean take any given job, and if you look at it and break it down into all the activities you perform in that job, there's always a series of things that we do that all of us would find pretty mundane, pretty tedious, and the kinds of things we don't necessarily get a whole lot of satisfaction from, but even more so, aren't necessarily things that are exploiting our human intelligence.
So let me say something, maybe a little more provocative. I was out at a conference in California. About this many people were having a discussion after this. And people were talking about the impact of AI and the digital tech. People are going to stop doing mundane things, as you mentioned, and do really much better cool things. And then somebody said, I want to remind you that half the people have an IQ of 100 or less. And as soon as he said that, the room was silent for about 10 seconds, right? Which gets to the notion that not everybody's going to be able to do everything in the future. Some of the new jobs that are going to be created require high degrees of specialization and intellect and capacity. And so I think, you know, my desire is to create as many people I come in contact with and make sure they're on the, if there is a winner and loser, to make sure they're winners. So, but I think it's important for us to be honest about what people's opportunities are. This isn't going to be all roses for people.
No, it's not. But I also don't think that we should be measuring that success in terms of, are people going to become the next Bezos of the world? You know, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think this is about that, elevating people to have that kind of stature, wealth, power, control. But even the lowest of McDonald's workers can find benefit in this. And some of this is not just dependent upon their own ability to embrace and make use of. It's how they're trained. It's what they are asked to do. It's the roles that they're involved in performing. And so it's not about IQ differentiation. You know, those who have higher IQ know how to use technology and therefore will win, and those who don't won't. It's really about how across the entire spectrum, the things that people do, how AI will supplement them in doing that, will help them do what they do already, do that better in many cases. In some cases, you know, it will eliminate those jobs, but, you know, we've seen this effect, and it has less to do with AI than it has to do with technology, technological evolution. Some jobs simply will be eliminated because they're no longer necessary. And some of that will be because AI is doing it for them, but in many cases it's going to be because the economy has shifted to the point where what they were doing is not needed. It doesn't need to be done. An AI doesn't need to do it, human doesn't need to do it, doesn't need to be done because it's no longer relevant to building the economy.
So one of the research projects we've done at Rumjog is we looked at some of the more popular jobs. Ironically enough, people often get this wrong. The top job in this country across most of the states is truck driver. And when you look at the automation of the transportation sector through autonomous vehicles, which is, you can argue when it's going to happen, but let's just say it happens within 10 years. What are those people going to do? Now, because if you talk to truck drivers about these concepts, to me, and this is where I get to the notion, or I want to sort of challenge you, Rob, and just the audience a little bit, is the ability of the truck drivers to make the pivot into another role in the economy that they can contribute, where somebody will pay them a wage and a living that allows them to take care of their families in the same way they do today. Because to me, it gets, and again, it does go back to aptitude, or you can use IQ as a proxy for that. If those people don't have the ability to move into the new roles, and what are those new roles, by the way? I don't know what they all are, but their new roles will certainly be created. What are they going to do? And this is a public policy discussion that probably needs to happen more often than not. So.
Yeah. No, look, I'm not going to candy coat it. The reality is that some people will be displaced.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's going to be. I don't think that we can examine the nature of technological impact when we narrow in on a single instance of a job description any more than we could back when, you know, when textile manufacturing entered into the space where, you know, now we're using machines to knit fabric together as opposed to individuals. There's just a fundamental transformation that's going to occur, and it will have the consequence of eliminating certain jobs, but what those individuals do, it will vary depending on the individual. And it'll somewhat depend on what new opportunities are created as a result of this advancement in technology. So yes, we can get very hypothetical and focus on just one narrow example, and we can all come up with the example that we think represents the extreme, and I'm not going to tell you that won't happen. What I will tell you is that as a general economic effect at a macro level, we're going to see the evolution of how we measure productivity. We're going to see an evolution in how we accomplish that productivity. New jobs are going to be created, old jobs will get thrown away. Most jobs in the middle are just simply going to change, and they're not going to be thrown away, but they're going to change.
So I had a colleague of mine wrote a book, Martin Ford, called Lights in the Tunnel. He wrote another book called The Rise of the Robots that came after that. But the first book, Lights in the Tunnel, he introduces the notion that digital businesses concentrate wealth. In the Bain report that I referenced, Labor 2030, they talk about digital businesses concentrating wealth. And what does that mean? It means that the means of production rely less on labor, and so the owners of those businesses are able to take a larger cut and not have to share the spoils with the labor class because there's less of them supporting their. You can look at companies like Uber, Facebook, Instagram when they bought them. It's just a handful of employees relative to a firm like a Walmart that has about $130,000 of revenue per employee, whereas I think Facebook something like $4 or $5 million of revenue per employee. Very different business. So when we concentrate wealth, that wealth is moving away from the middle class. And there was another YouTube video that went out 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a lot of you saw it, called Wealth Inequality in America. It talks about how wealth is shifting to the top 1% to top 5%. And again, I go back to that as laying the foundation of this concept of winners and losers. And I don't worry about the people in this room per se or the colleagues that I work with. Everybody's going to be much better off in a couple of years. I'm worried about the eroding middle class and what's going to happen, because I'll go back, the Bain report, very well written, it's pretty dry, but they said that there's going to be a public policy intervention. That could be universal basic income, it could be a lot of regulations around how we're going to do that, because if the masses are this affected by this or see a few winners and people not having it, they're going to do something. What's your sense, Rob, about public policy relative to that? And do you agree that digital economies create wealth concentration?
So I do wonder how much of what we're seeing in terms of middle class erosion is a consequence of technology evolution, and how much of it has to do with the pre-existing public policies that are playing out and the tendency for power to accumulate power. That said, I do think that public policy is an important factor in this. I can't see today how public policy will, in fact, change to benefit society in the way that you described without there also being some kind of revolution that goes on behind it. Until we as a society muster the energy and the political will to impose our interests on our public policy makers, they're less inclined to respond to us. They don't have any personal incentive to go do so. And so I think there's some other issues that need to be dealt with in that. Now, I want to go back to the digital economy effect here for a moment, because there's actually two sides of this. Yes, everything that we've been talking about is going to occur. We're going to see transformation. We're going to see those who are able to embrace the digital economy to advance themselves in some way. But there's also a fallacy in the digital economy too, and that is the whole world of digitalization, going all the way back even before we think of electronic digitalization, go back to the abacus and the introduction of banks and lending and merchants and all the things that went on for the last 5,000 years that led up to what we now think of as the digital economy. Much of that economic structure is grounded on trust. Our banking system is based on the fact that we trust those institutions to keep track of the money that we claim to be depositing, keep track of the interest that they owe us as a result of us having given over that money. But what is money? Money is just digits now. It's just electronic bits, and we trust them to have managed those bits well enough to represent and reconcile that. But the same thing's true of commerce, of our medical practices. Everywhere where digital processing is being used as the grounding for the work that's being done there, that presumes that we trust them to have employed the right software, the right hardware, and the right practices to make what they're doing stand up and work. That trust can be broken in many ways. It could be done through institutional malice. It could be done through individual malice. It could be done through a failure of the software to work. It could be done because the mathematicians that have created the encryption algorithms that we so heavily depend on today actually made a mistake along the way, or somebody else came along and figured out how to disprove that math. There's lots of opportunity for failure in this digital world. And we need to be conscious of that, because when we talk about winners and losers, we may all lose at some point if we're faced with that kind of undermining or eroding activity in the things that we trust.
Anybody have any questions?
It's like I heard one talk with Nick Bostrom, and he was talking about how one of the scariest aspects of this automation thing is that right now, the framework of our business landscape is just short-term focus on profit and nothing else. And you apply smart machines to that goal, and we are going to rip through our planet's resources so fast, like it's ridiculous. So I was just curious about your thoughts on it.
So I'll just repeat the question so everybody could hear it.
Sure.
So you're referring to a point of view that Nick Bostrom had about short-term focus of the business cycle.
Yeah.
Applying digital technologies to that, we'll have a Thomas Malthusian impact to the planet's resources that will just burn through everything quickly for the achievement of the next quarter's profit. So let me take a look. So there is a guy named Peter Diamandis with Singularity University. He wrote a book called Abundance, and then he wrote a book called Bold after that. And he challenged the notion of the law of diminishing return in that sense, in this way. It would be easy for us to take a linear paradigm and say, we're going to eat the planet's resources, but also at the same time, I could go back just even 5 or 6 years ago, maybe more like 10 years ago, and we were looking at oil at $140 a barrel. It was going crazy. All of a sudden, we can't use petroleum products. Well, now we sit here today with technology impacting. The U.S. is exporting petroleum products today, where we were a huge net importer 10 years ago. So, and we're starting to shift more to renewables. So, without addressing specifically, I do think there's a chance that we can burn through the resources, but I'm going to look at it more optimistically, the way Diamandis did. And I would encourage you to look through those books, because they're more inspiring. It's easy to me. The Malthusian argument about limited resources and this law of diminishing return is negative energy. I can buy into that, but I choose to think more positively. That's my answer.
I think entropy is an incredibly powerful force in the universe, and it operates pretty effectively here on Earth too. Let's take the scenario you described, and we do start burning through resources at some exponential rate, which we have been. There's always going to be some tipping point where we've reduced the efficiency of that to the point where now something else has to break. And this is, there's been a lot of wars in our human history that have been based on resource contention. We're not past that. We're not so advanced as a society and civilization that we won't go to war over competing on resources. And so in some sense, that's an equalizing effect. On the other hand, again, it comes down to what are you trying to optimize for? Are you trying to optimize for the survivability of the human species, or are you trying to optimize for the survivability of the Earth? And frankly, the Earth doesn't give a shit, you know, if we're here or not. The Earth is going to be just fine without us. So if you're really thinking about it primarily in terms of not resources, but how do we come together as a community of people and optimize the survivability of us as a society, then there will be equalizing effects that will keep us from completely destroying
Let me give
the
you
things
one
that matter.
other. One of the things that we're talking about in our firm is what happens after all this? Like, what's the reaction of people? And so we talk about like almost a post-digital construct. And the framework that we're using is the experience economy, which is people are going to start valuing their time more than they value money. And money could be a reference of resources as well. So, and when we talk about that, in a sense, it gets to the notion that the consumer-driven economy encourages us to get more stuff. And I would argue that most of us, whether they want to admit it or not, have too much stuff. And stuff does not connote happiness. So imagine that we're sitting here 10 years from now and there's a cultural shift away from stuff and a cultural shift towards time management and social outcomes as a way for us to guide whether or not we're being successful. So it's not that I have a big house and 3 cars and all these, lots of clothes, but I have better time management. So imagine that's possible. I'd like to think that that's what's going to happen, because as we digitize our environment, we walk away from the analog things that clutter our world, and it's the analog things that deplete the resources, not the digital ones. Any other questions? It's Harsh.
Are you talking about trust? So, do you think tech industry is becoming like new Wall Street when it comes to some lack of trust within masses? Like, I'm in tech industry for the last 3 years. I got rid of my Instagram. I stopped posting on Facebook, and I stopped believing in every article that I read on Twitter. So
Brilliant.
How do you think this lack of trust that people are beginning to have against tech industry would sort of overall impact adoption and how we see the tech industry playing a broader role in our lives?
So let me rephrase that and let Rob answer. So Harsh asked a question about trust as a integral component of commerce, everything from banking to reliance on digital technologies, and in some cases, Harsh, the reality that at some point you realize you're the customer, not you're the product, not the customer, when you use free services like Facebook and Instagram. And so the loss of that trust, whether it be not relying on media as much as we used to and questioning the truth, what's that role of society? How does that trust affect the adoption levels of digital? So.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, first of all, let me say, I think we, all of us in this room, on the podcast, everywhere, we need to start exercising more conscious awareness of the importance of the trust that we hand out, you know, sometimes without even thinking about it. The trust that we give to other people, that we presume in other people, in institutions, in people, in practices, in, you know, the merchants that we deal with, and so on and so forth. You know, we have to be more conscious of that trust that we give out to them, and recognize that the trust they demand of us is tenuous, and that they need to earn that with us every day, over and over again. And that will have a tempering effect on the adoption of digital or any technological advancement. It will have a dampening effect, no doubt about it. I also think it's going to make it healthier. So the adoption that does get embraced, that does advance, that does evolve, that does innovate, will be grounded on a truth that is more sustainable than the one that I think we've slipped into as a consequence of not being conscious of that trust factor.
Imagine being able to take the ambiguity of trust that exists today. You know, so like if your cell phone listens to every word you say, what they do with it is debatable. People have Alexa and Google Home in their home. They're listening to all this stuff. They're using Instagram and tracking devices like Facebook and other things like that to know everything about you. And so people are stepping back from that and saying, oh, I'm not sure, this is, I think it's a bridge too far in many cases. You see people unplug, right? Imagine new business models that come out of that flip it to selling the trust in a new business model. So I unplugged free TV about 15 months ago. I just unplug it. I will not watch it. I won't watch ABC, NBC. I won't watch any of it. I'll watch pay TV like Netflix or HBO or something like that. But I choose what to watch, when to watch it, and I don't want to see ads. Now I'm probably manipulated by product placement and content and stuff like that. But at a minimum, I look back and I say, I'm better off for it. And so imagine now we can start to create business models that sell trust back to you, leveraging the digital technology to put you back in control. I think you're going to be back in control on media consumption. So imagine paying for Facebook and not being leveraged and thrown salacious content. Or, you know, if you use YouTube, they're promoting the next video to keep you on YouTube to look at ads, right? So in order to do that, they can't show you something boring like the Labor 2030 report from Bain. You're not going to go read that. You should go read it because you'll be better off than watching, you know, kittens argue or fight and it's a funny video. That's salacious. People are going to go watch that, right? So imagine starting to create new business models that are going to leverage this trust shift that's going to happen in the marketplace.
You mean like the kinds of business models we had 100 years ago when merchants actually had to sell quality for you to get you to buy what they're going to sell you? Sorry.
So you said something interesting that we are the product as opposed to the consumer of whatever it is Facebook. And talking about making Facebook or Instagram a pay for service, but replacing that trust. Well, what if the opposite was true? Where we understand that we're a product, and instead of paying Facebook for the trust, Facebook would actually pay us for sharing our data or selling it. You were saying earlier that in the game of winners and losers, it's really about competition between humans, and jobs always get displaced. So do you see some sort of formal ascription of value to humans individually?
So I'll just rephrase the question. So the issue gets to the notion, and probably everybody's heard this, if you're using something for free, you're the product. So the flip is, let's just pay for it, then I don't become the product. But there's another that says, if I'm the product, I want a piece of the action.
You don't want to be compensated.
Let me get compensated for that.
Yeah.
I think that model could emerge. I think unless people demand it, it's not going to emerge. It does exist already and has existed for some time at the very high end. So people will get appearance fees, right? So you want to show up at an event, you get someone who's an influencer or a celebrity, they're paid to be there, right? And you know, because they're trying to build awareness. And so things like that have existed at the high end. The issue is, can it be democratized down to the individual? I don't think that's going to happen unless people start unplugging. Until people start unplugging from free content, whether that be the network television, Facebook, Google, and go to paid services or be more assertive in how they consume their time or how they spend their time rather, then I don't think you're going to see a reaction to those companies, because why would they pay you when they don't have to?
I think it also goes back to this question of trust too, which is when you become more conscious of the trust that you're giving other people, you're at the same time going to realize that what you're giving them is something of value, and that's something that you could potentially monetize. I think there are some scaling issues in all this. You know, how do you know, what is the value of the actions that you take on a given day? You know, is that worth a few cents? Is that worth a few bucks? I don't know, but, you know, then there's, you know, how do you price that? How do you price that against an economy of 7 billion other people who are also trying to sell their data about themselves? You know, what are those economics? that's a relatively complex problem, I think, that has to be solved. But if you begin with, you're conscious of the fact that you are giving yourself away in this and that you need to challenge these people who are taking that data from you and challenge the trustworthiness of that, then I think you can begin to enter into a conversation about what is the value of who you are and the data that you provided to that.
Questions? TJ, do you have a question? Yep, one more.
There are models out there where you market credit cards. Every time you use a credit card, we get miles.
Yeah.
They're paying us to use, our information too, right? Because credit card companies take that information and they sell it to others. They try to mark profits for us. Cash out cards, right? It's the same thing. So you take the Facebook example, you can see that moving model is more like a credit card, where you get paid based on your usage on Facebook. Facebook is where you get paid for miles or otherwise. So it's not hard to imagine that the models of these free utilities, whether it's Google, Facebook, YouTube, or whatever, eventually work a model where the more you use, like a credit card, the more you get paid for.
So Rob was just mentioning, I'm just repeating as everybody could hear, he's saying that people being paid for services is already happening. And use a credit card as an example, whether it be the cashback or miles program. Those programs exist. In a mature industry like credit cards relative to, say, social media, it wouldn't be, if we started to see competition for time and eyeballs, to see incentives to keep you there beyond salacious content. So I do think that that's a possibility to go see, but I think it's really going to boil down to, if I could impart to you something that I would say is, I would be more thoughtful of how you think about and spend your time, right? There's nothing wrong with going on YouTube and looking at one thing and then finding out an hour later you're watching about how to grow mushrooms in your basement. People have done that. We've all done it, right? You're like, well, how the hell am I watching this after an hour? Well, that's just it happens, and that's fun, and that's a discovery of interesting content. Go see that, but you don't want to live that way. So you want to be more thoughtful. So just be more thoughtful of your time. And if somebody wants to incent you to do something, like, for example, I use Amazon Prime. I think it's a good service. Now you could argue that I'm being manipulated by Amazon to buy stuff I don't need. Karen tells me all the time, stop buying stuff. I'm buying too much crap on Amazon. I like the service. It's very convenient. It's the alternative for me is it was not as good as you. So I actually like it. I think for people who use Facebook, a lot of them get a lot out of it. So it's not like it's just a one-way street. You're getting a lot of value for these things. If you use email and Gmail, something like that, or some of these free email services from, you're getting a service that you used to have to pay for, and now it's free. So you're not getting nothing, but I do think our time is probably less valued by us individually and us collectively, so that we can start to demand, some compensation for that.
I think that's right, but we should also distinguish between being compensated for who we are and what we produce versus getting a discount for behaviors that we're being influenced to perform. In the credit card case, we're not actually getting paid for using a credit card. We're actually getting a discount against how much we pay that credit card company in interest rates for behaving and for using that credit card in a certain way. Insurance, has a lot of insurance companies now have these devices. You plug them into your car and it monitors the way that you drive. Monitors the way that you drive and will give you a discount for driving behaviors that reduce their risk. You're not being compensated for who you are or what you produce in that. You're being discounted for adopting behaviors that they prefer, that are beneficial to them. Again, be conscious of what is happening here and what you're doing to give over yourself to these other people. And if you choose to do that, and if it's beneficial to you and you find, value in that, great, do it. But don't do it because you weren't aware that that's what you were doing.
There's a series on Netflix called Black Mirror. I don't know if any of you have seen it. I would highly encourage you to watch just one show at a time. And skip the first one. You can go back and watch it after you watch a few and acquire a taste for the show, but do not let that show. But anyway, there's one of the episodes, I think it's like season 4, the first episode. It's Ron Howard's daughter, the redheaded girl, I forget her name. She's in the Jurassic World movies, I forget who she was. But the whole thing is, think of the Uber concept where you rate the driver rates you. So you get a score. So if you have Uber, you can go on your profile and you can see you're a 4.5 or a 4.8, or God forbid you're a 3.2 and you try to get a ride at night because no one's going to pick you up. But in this, they take it to the next level where every interaction we have is digitally and socially scored, and your ability to do things like even access buildings or travel or rent a car is tied to your social score. Now, this is a science fiction show that takes technology to the next level and shows how you can be a winner with a high score or a loser with a low score and how you manage that. Now, unless you think that that's crazy, China's already doing it. So, I'd be interested. Did you see that episode, Rob?
No, I don't see it.
But, how many people saw that episode with that redheaded girl? Now, that was pretty creepy, wasn't it? I thought it was. And the most interesting character to me was that female truck driver with a 1.5. I want to hang out with her. Any other comments? Questions? TJ?
So speaking of truck drivers, you mentioned before, top job, and the tension that people will have, the trouble they'll have with making a transition once the service or a job that they're associated with gets automated and we move into this digital future. So for Rob, your experience at IBM Watson, knowledge of artificial intelligence, it seems that there's a trend towards democratization or access to some of these advances in AI. So I know at Watson, a few years back, made publicly available APIs to some of the services platforms. Other platforms some of them. Is that democratization and level of access and reduction of the barriers to entry? Will that be something that helps the worker kind of make the transition, make that a bit easier as we kind of move towards a more automated future? Is that a plus or is it getting backward?
So let me rephrase that so everybody can hear that. TJ was saying is a lot of firms who are deploying advanced technologies are opening up their technologies through open APIs, and that lowers the barriers for participation. They don't have to have some huge license arrangement. And does that democratization and access to technologies, will that be more empowering to people or accelerate the change to people's demise? Is that fair, TJ? Okay.
Yeah, so look, I mean, yes, of course. I think that when you lower the barrier to entry, it opens up the opportunity for greater innovation. The thing about innovation, though, is that not all of it is successful, and not all of it is useful, and not all of it is sustainable. So we're going to see, I think, as a consequence of that, isn't necessarily better innovation intrinsically, but it's certainly going to create a much wider diversity of innovation, and that will funnel into some sort of filtering mechanism that will, reduce that down to a few innovations that really matter and are sustainable and are effective. But I think having a better diverse base to start with is always a good thing for society. It's always a good thing for the earth. It's always a good thing for, how we as both a species in this world as well as, individually advance. So yes, I think it's a really good thing, and I do think that it democratizes, but I think the democratization actually occurs in multiple levels here. And in fact, it's one of the things that we didn't talk about when we talked about the digital economy, because there's a different way of measuring winning and losing for those people who are invested in creating the digital economy, creating innovations that advance the digital economy, and Bezos being a good example of somebody who has sort of stepped into the digital economy and created something that is unique and has added to the overall digital economy, versus those of the rest of us who may or may not ever advance in that way, but will harness and utilize the digital economy either to our advantage or to the advantage of the group around us. And I think that that's another thing to think about in terms of democratization that occurs with technology, because one of the things I really find fascinating about AI is that since it learns from data that we give it, either individually or from whatever source of data we get, it's less about the intellect that an individual put into those algorithms, and it has more to do with the collective intellect represented by the data that went into training those algorithms to perform in the future. And that's a form of democratization that we should really embrace. Not because I'm an AI bigot, but because I think that actually improves the quality of the resulting technology that we end up using. It's no longer about, let's put it in real practical terms, this one doctor's opinion about how to diagnose a disease and how to treat it. It's about this entire collection of doctors and their aggregate intelligence that in some cases cancels out the bad intelligence that other doctors have, in other cases amplifies, common knowledge and intelligence amongst that group. And I think that that is a really powerful idea.
I think the open APIs is going to drive innovation in the economy with startups have access to a broad array of new innovations. So there's a term called recombinant innovation. And recombinant innovation it's a deconstructed word. It's just taking things and recombining them, creating new ingredients or new recipes for innovation. And if you look at like Uber, all it did was it took a couple of technologies and put them together, and it created I don't know what are they worth, 40 or 50 billion dollars, some crazy valuation. But nothing they do is really earth-shattering. But they did take 2 or 3 things and bring them together: smartphones, GPS, taxi dispatch, smartphones, all that stuff. They brought it together. Here's a new $50 billion valuation. When you look at this recombinant innovation, you think of Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb. It took like 1,000 tries, but he had to do it in an analog world. Well, today, AI and machine learning is doing recombinant innovation and coming up with really cool designs. So some of for example, airline panels are being done with AI and machine learning. And it's very interesting that they come up with solutions and designs that people would never come up with. And what's interesting is they look a lot like things you find in nature, which is pretty interesting. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but there's a lot of interesting things around recombinant innovation that's going to drive, that's part of the digital agenda. Because if I go to something more mundane, if I look at application development, the testing that's done, machine testing is much better than having engineers write test scripts and testing whether a code release is going to work in production. It's much better to have machines run, instead of running 50 tests, run 5,000 tests in the cloud. So I think recombinant innovation is going to accelerate the broader set of innovation by allowing startups to come in there, and you're going to find new companies like Uber pop up by taking an interesting set of things and bringing them together.
Cool. I think we'll wrap things up. That was awesome. Thank you, guys.